Hey dudes and dudettes, it's me, E.H. Ivins, and this is a special episode of The Radical Reset. Today we're going to talk about it's basically, if you're paying any attention at all, it's going to scare the shit out of you. I mean, that's all I can say. We're going to talk about what's going to happen in 2021. You know, as I walk around and I talk to people just in my regular life, and I'm sure this has happened to you too, a lot of people think 2020 has been a giant shitstorm of a year because of, obviously, COVID, the shutdown of the economy, yada, yada, yada. But they're all missing it. 2020 is going to seem like the happiest of memories after what's coming in 2021. Maybe 2022 at the latest, but again, I don't claim to have mystical powers. I don't claim to be a seer. I don't claim to see things that no one else can. I just have my mind, and free of all encumberment of career or ambition or any other potential conflict of interest that could steer me off. I think I see things more clearly than most people because I really don't give a shit. One of the things about going to prison is that your reputation is so destroyed that if you make an ass out of yourself and say something completely bizarre, it doesn't really matter. I mean, you can't ruin what's already ruined. So I'm going to go ahead and take a leap, and I hope you can follow with me along on why I think 2021 is going to be the worst year in American history, and why I think it potentially could be the worst year in history ever. It could be the worst year in modern world history because of what's coming. Now, that's a huge statement. And if it doesn't shake you to your toes, now what you're probably saying right now is, who the fuck is this guy? He's got like 40 people that watch him regularly. He's a pimple on the ass of the great American thought process. And why should you pay any fucking attention to me? And why do I take myself remotely seriously? But a lot of times it's the lone voice in the woods that sees it when everybody else doesn't. And it's not that everyone else is stupid, but everyone else is conflicted by their lives and their own personal, what's the word I'm looking for? Advancement and success and power and influence that they can't, even if they see it, they can't bring themselves to believe it. It's kind of like, and before I say what I'm about to say, please don't be offended, but it's kind of like religion. I was having a discussion today in a divorce chat room, actually, where I was giving someone advice, and he was conflicted over what religion to raise the children with the divorce with the wife and la 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 la. And the wife was an atheist, and he was very religious. And as I was pointing out to him how to look at his soon-to-be, they call them soon-to-be-X, STBX on this website. I think it's kind of cute how they abbreviate that. But anyway, he was going on and on how his soon-to-be-X was an atheist, and I just pointed out to him that atheism, he made it sound like it was another religion. Why does she believe that? No one believes. Atheism is just a filler word for disbelief. The atheism is the absence of belief in a God. It's not a belief. You don't become an atheist to join. There's nothing to believe. Atheism means you don't believe anything about this, that basically you're skeptical. So I hope that you take that point of view, that you're skeptical, and you're going to listen to me and let me prove to you why I believe 2021 is going to be the worst year ever. And it's important for you to, I think, embrace this, because if you don't, you won't be able to protect yourself. And if you can't protect yourself, well, you're in for a rough ride. Okay, so let me start at the beginning. And let me be very, very basic. The reason that 2021 is going to be the worst year in history, in American history for sure, is because China is going to collapse. Now, I know that the mainstream right now is completely enamored with China. They think that China is the one country in the world that's got their act together. There's something about mainstream intellectuals, and I use the word intellectual very, very loosely, because I think that most people who consider themselves intellectuals are pseudo-intellectuals. They think they're smarter than they are, but they look at China and they look at the big cities, they look at how the government seems to be able to control everything and how they can respond quickly because they're a totalitarian state. There's something in the mind of intellectuals. They so love totalitarian states because I think secretly in the back of their heads they all believe that one day if they could be the dictator, they would be somehow the most benevolent dictator in history, and they're so smart that they can figure out how to run the country. So when they look at a dictator like Xi Jinping, the dictator of China, the so-called president, but effectively the absolute ruler, they see a man who is doing all the things that they secretly wish they could. And because China is very good at covering up the worst of their abuses, they just kind of sneak out like the Uyghurs and things like that. And in a country as huge as China and with 1.3 billion people, it's hard to know what's going on in the interior. We only know what we're allowed to know. You know, there are 5 things that a country has to be in order to be successful. And this is what intellectuals never meet. I want to go through, never understand. I want to go through them all 5. And at the end, you're going to begin to understand why I know China is going to collapse, okay? Number 1, in order for a country to be truly strong, to have a truly strong economy and a truly strong civil culture, they must have a strong exchangeable currency. In other words, they can't manipulate the price of their currency. It has to float on the free market, and it has to be strong, and it has to be freely exchangeable. You have to be able to turn it on the free market into other currencies without any government interference, and that is simply not true of the Chinese yuan, or the renminbi, depending on what you want to call it. The Chinese currency is only semi-floating, controlled largely by the central Chinese authorities, and is exchangeable only as China allows it to be exchangeable, and they set the exchange rate. Now, they get away with this because they're China, and because so many countries in the world want to believe that China is strong because they're trying to exploit those markets. But they're missing it. They simply do not have a fully exchangeable currency. They manipulate the yuan shamelessly. That's number 1. Number 2 on my list of 5 things a country must have to be a great country. They must have strong protection of private property. And it doesn't take a lot of genius to look at China and watch them lock up people like, for example, Jimmy Lai, a Chinese entrepreneur who is telling the truth about the government, by the way. And they regularly... China is not a democracy or a dictatorship, they're a kleptocracy. You know, they've evolved from a communist system to a system of basically organized one-party theft. And they do not respect private property unless they have a piece of the action. Many Chinese companies are nothing but fronts for the government, and the ones that aren't just fronts for the government constantly operate with one eye on the government and are protected by highly restrictive laws on how they can use their own private property. So to say that China protects the rule of private property, it would be absurd. They do not protect the ownership of private property. They do it better than they did when they were communists, because in a communist system there is no private property, but what they've done is come up with this hybridized version of Chinese semi-private property that the world doesn't seem to notice, but is not the free exercise of your own private property. Number 3, in order for a country to be successful and to sustain and last, it must have free speech and a free press, both. Why? Because the government can't be trusted, and because we rely, as much as you and I can hate the press, the one thing you can say about the press in America and the rest of the free world is there's a lot of it, okay? And with the internet, there's a lot more than there's ever been before. And they come in all across the spectrum. I know that those of you on the right think the entire mainstream media is completely slanted to the left, and you're right, it is, in the United States. But there are still plenty of places, you know, I'll start with Fox News, whose audience is bigger than all the other leftist outlets combined, is a conservative outlet, and you know, Breitbart News, and you know, and then there are lots of nutty ones too. I'm not going to get into all the various outlets, but the fact is we have a thriving free press, and that means millions of eyes looking at what the government does and what people in the government do every day. It's very hard for there to be systemic corruption when you have the eyes of everyone looking at it that can't be shut up if they find something embarrassing. So in other words, right now we have, you know, a narcissistic, soon-to-be ex-president, you know, saying that there's, you know, fraud in the election, but there are thousands of eyes who have looked at it, and everyone on the right and left has said there is, you know, no systemic fraud. There's some minor isolated, and I know some of you who are Trump fanatics are jumping up in your seat right now, but that's just nutty shit. The fact of the matter is, you can't have millions of eyes looking for a conspiracy, not find it, and say that there is. I mean, if there was a conspiracy, it would have been found because of the free press. As much as we hate it, the press is the watchdog of lies of the government. You cannot trust politicians. The press, imperfect as it is vital. Free speech and anyone who thinks that China has free speech or free press is smoking heroin. Okay, that's all I can say. Number 4, you must have the courts, a court system, particularly a civil court system, that protects private property including intellectual property. And do I have to tell any of you that China has no such thing? You know, when you go to work to do business in China, it is likely, not even possible, but probable, that someone's going to steal your intellectual property. In other words, how you do, the secret sauce that makes whatever it is that you do possible, and they're going to knock it off. And there is no law in China that forbids the Chinese from stealing or defrauding foreign investors. Now, if you think I'm making that up, I'm going to give you a little. You know, I did a lot of research prior to this podcast before I got into it and before I got into, you know, where I was going to go today. But I want to give you, and I know that that's very mundane, and I don't expect you to do all that research, but to make your life very, very simple, I want you, those of you who subscribe to Hulu, and I'm not sure if it's available anywhere else, check it out, to check out a documentary called The China Hustle. It was, I believe, I could be wrong about this, I think Mark Cuban funded it, but it's a really well done piece on what's really going on at lower levels of China, but then you just extrapolate from that. It's not only eye-opening, but it's entertaining and well done. Now, it's not perfect, and it has a little progressive leftist spin to it, but just throw all that out. It is really well done. You know, don't get hooked by finding one piece of a documentary you don't agree with. Watch The China Hustle on Hulu, okay? And Mr. Producer, please provide the link to people. By the way, if you don't have Hulu, join the one for $6 for 1 month where you have to watch commercials, watch the show, and then cancel your membership. It's worth the $6. I'm just telling you. Check out The China Hustle. Now, the point of that is there is no way to redress grievances, and the Chinese are free to steal from foreigners, which they're doing in a massive, massive way. And finally, for a country to be successful, in the end, it has to be at least, to some extent, democratic. Okay, now, this is going to be slightly obscure, but if we turn the clocks back to the fall of the Soviet Union in 1988 and 89, and then President Boris Yeltsin, he tried to do something that he failed at, but was actually the right idea, and history will judge him to have been right. He tried to introduce a democracy and a free market at the same time, and it ended up in chaos. Now, it ended up in chaos, and they ended up with Putin in the end, who is a dictator effectively. I mean, he pretends to be a president, but he's a dictator effectively, and they're not going to be any more successful than the Chinese are, but they're not as much a threat to us because we are not as invested in Russia. In other words, the Russians are our adversaries in many ways, but we don't have any American money tied up in Russia because no one in their right mind thinks Russia has a future. Because Russia, ironically, is much more open than China, believe it or not, much more free than China, believe it or not, thanks to Boris Yeltsin. And yes, Russia ended up in an oligarchy, and yes, it's a big mess and everything else, but they tried to do it the right way. China thought they could keep a dictatorship and have a free market at the same time, and you can't. And and that's true of any dictatorship, because once you allow the free exchange of ideas, you lose the grip on your dictatorship. So China, as a dictatorship, allows no democracy. But in order for there to be sustained success, a country must be a democracy so that the average person participates in the full success of the country and feels that they're not being cheated. Now, not that everyone expects to be, Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos, but they have to have a path where they don't feel like they're being fucked by their own government, and that is a democratic path. And no one can argue that China is taking a democratic path. So, what we have today is a country that fails all five. Let me review it. They have no exchangeable currency. They have no protection of private property. They have no free press or free speech. They have no civil courts to adjudicate grievances and protect intellectual and other property rights, and they have no democracy. They cannot succeed. China will collapse. It is only a matter of time. The only way I can be wrong about this is it might happen in 2022 instead of 2021. Now, why do I think it's coming to a head? Because China has defrauded the world and taken in billions and trillions of dollars and dollar equivalents and other currencies, investing in China in a mirage. Because we can't trust any Chinese numbers, because there's no free press to double check what the government says, we eat it up. And the mainstream eats it up and eats up these lies because they're right now making money off of the Chinese lies in the same way, and I know this is going to be a leap, but follow me on this, the same way that the mortgage companies and the banks in the United States fucked the American people selling junky shit mortgages packaged in derivative portfolios that brought down the economy in 2008 is exactly what's going on with China, only a million times bigger in a country of 1.3 billion people, who's sending out shares of stock in bullshit companies that foreign investors are scooping up like candy because they think China is the one place in the world where there's growth going on when the rest of the world is mired in a COVID recession, and they're pouring money in. And when someone says, wait a minute, how can you believe anything being said? Their answer is, they're being the mainstream investors of both Wall Street and the rest of the world, their answer is always, you're being paranoid, you're being crazy, that's nutty, they're in the... Look, the only way to really know what's going on is to go over in China and look. And people who have gone over to China and looked have found that it's bullshit. But blinded by greed, the mainstream of American finances and world finances just simply don't want to believe it. China is a mirage. Xi Jinping is exactly like Mao Zedong with a better tailor, okay? I know a lot of people think that he's somehow a more modern dictator. He just dresses better. He's the same thing. Why? How can I know that for sure? Because in a dictatorship, and particularly a statist dictatorship that controls everything, so it has enormous power to control everyone's lives in the end, that attraction of power and to rise in a statist system, when only the worst rise to the top. Let me explain. Here in the United States, let's use the example of the election of Donald Trump. Donald Trump was elected president over the dead bodies of millions and millions of progressives, liberals, and mainstream Republicans, for that matter, who fucking hate him. And they fucking hate him because he's a disruptor. But what's interesting about Trump, and I don't like him either, by the way, but what's interesting about Trump's original election was he was elected essentially over the dead bodies of the mainstream. Everyone hated him to begin with. They looked for a million reasons and ways to stop him, phony Russian collusion hoaxes and everything else. We can go through that whole bullshit story. The fact that I don't like Trump doesn't mean I don't recognize that the Russian collusion thing was a hoax. You can know both, right? You don't have to be a Trumpist to see that that was bullshit. But it was a manifestation of the mainstream trying to kill him. But they couldn't. And they couldn't kill him because we're a democracy. And in democracy, people can rise up out of nowhere and institute phenomenal reform and changes, which puts off the revolution ultimately, if you think about it. Think about that. So Donald Trump was just the most recent manifestation, but throughout American history, we have had gigantic figures. When I say gigantic figures, historical people who have stepped in and changed the way the country looks at things. Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt. Ronald Reagan. There have been people who come out of, who the mainstream hates. Everyone I mentioned at the time of their election was not just disliked, but despised. None of us were alive then, so you have to be a student of history to know this. But all of the people I mentioned were despised by the mainstream in their lifetimes. But because we're in a democracy, they were able to come from the outside and affect change on the inside. That is impossible in a dictatorship, and in every dictatorship, only the worst rises to the top, because ruthlessness is the talent that's required to climb to the top of a dictatorial system. You don't get there by a pretty smile or giving a great speech or getting in touch with the public or making everybody feel good about themselves or understanding what's going on or having clever programs or anything else that would be typical in a democratic society in an election. So for example, and I'll use a different country, I'm going to use Great Britain. When Margaret Thatcher ran against the mainstream, okay, in Great Britain, and then completely transformed the country, she came from nowhere, okay? She was a shop owner's daughter who was, not of the upper classes by any stretch of the imagination, who through her own grit and determination rose through the ranks of a democratic system through ideology and good ideas. She didn't murder anybody, she didn't imprison anybody, she didn't crush protests, she embraced it, and she, in the 11 years, a little over 11 years, that she was the Prime Minister of England, completely transformed the British economy and the British culture at that time, okay? Now, today, Donald Trump has done that in many ways in the American culture, and there will be other people coming in the future to change. Sometimes they don't succeed. Bernie Sanders was an example of a guy trying to come from the outside, pardon me, I just knocked the camera, trying to come from the outside that failed. Now, he failed because his ideas sucked, but none of that could ever happen in China one way or the other. There is no opposition that's tolerated in China. They arrest them and lock them up. If any of you don't believe that, look up the story right now today of Jimmy Lai, L-A-I. You can look that up for yourself. I don't want to spend hours and hours in this podcast going into where, not obscure, but, sideline issues to the central issue, which is China's going to collapse. But let me get down to the bottom line on why China's going to collapse. First of all, their economy is bullshit. I'll give you a personal example. I have done business in China. Years ago, I was associated with one of the executives that worked for me, had a business, and how I was involved in it is I lent her money to do it. She was bringing in manufactured goods together with another guy from China and reselling them in the United States. Now, let me explain that. Basically socks, mostly socks, white socks. This is going to sound boring, but this is a nice little story about how a very marginal business can be unbelievably profitable. You can become a millionaire selling socks. So she and her partner and she would go to China, go to factories who had manufactured millions, pardon me. I swallow a lot of air when I talk. And because of that, it looks like I'm always burping because I get enthusiastic, and as I talk fast, and as I talk fast, I breathe while I talk, and as I breathe while I talk, I swallow air, and as I swallow air while I talk, it looks like I pretty much am constantly burping. So please forgive that. That's just a personal affectation. Many times I have tried to slow down, but it kills my enthusiasm. So just kind of go with me, and when I occasionally catch myself and do a little, just understand that that's just me being over enthusiastic and swallowing air. Okay, so she would go to China and buy these socks from these factories for pennies on the dollar of what they were originally priced at, bring them back to the United States and resell them to stores like, for example, the dollar store or Payless and show, discount stores where they would then sell them. When you guys go into a Walmart, you see those packages of like a dozen pairs of white socks. Those are made in China and probably came from someone just like this woman and her partner that I funded back in the day. Now, the point of this whole story was, the reason these socks even existed is the factories in China were making millions of pairs of socks and then putting them in a warehouse and calling them sales. That's a really good example. They really were. They were booking them as sales on their books. And now they had to get rid of the fucking socks. Now, they didn't care whether the socks made a profit or not, because where their money had come from was American investors who had never gone over to look at the factory and look at the fact that they weren't making the money that they were claiming to make, and that they were throwing their socks into a warehouse and calling it sales. And then they were taking more money off the table by selling it to a third party, my associate and her partner, and making some money which they pocketed and didn't give to their investors off the side from the warehouse where it was booked as sales by the company originally. And if I've lost you in this, let me just say, this is what a criminal enterprise looks like. It was a lot of smoke and mirrors. And this was, in my personal experience, one little company. But as you're going to find out as you do your own research, it's not one, it's all of them. Alibaba, the big Chinese equivalent, so they say, of Amazon, is a mirage. It's a giant fraud. Jack Ma is a fraudster, and he is cheating the American people and the people of the world who have invested in Alibaba out of billions of dollars. And what will become of Jack Ma after cheating the world of all this money? Nothing. Nothing, because in China there is no law against fucking foreigners and out of their money. The Chinese view it as their right and privilege. Now, how this is going to translate into revolution is the people that are participating in this theft are actually a very small part of China. So if you traveled over to China now and went to a place like Beijing or Shanghai or Wuhan, where the virus came from, or any other major Chinese city, you're going to see tens of millions of people hustling about, and it looks like China's on fire, right? There's buildings everywhere. They're building constantly. There's the skyline. If you went to China and didn't go again for 5 years and went back, you wouldn't recognize the place you went to begin with, because they're constantly building. The thing is, that building is based on nothing. It's just a Potemkin village. Now I'm getting even more obscure. Potemkin was an officer of the Tsar at the time of the revolution. Well, actually, he was a nobleman under the Tsar at the time of the revolution. And to full foreigners, they built villages that showed prosperous Russian peasants living in these villages, and everything was great. And they were called Potemkin villages. Well, China is a giant Potemkin village. Everything that you're seeing when you go to Beijing and Shanghai, you're seeing all these people. It looks like everything's on fire, but you're not seeing the other billion people or more that live in the countryside that are not participating in the Chinese growth and are tired of being fucked. They know that the Chinese government is corrupt. corruption doesn't begin to explain it. They're corrupt on a scale that we as Americans and as Westerners and as Democrats, when I say, I mean that with a small d, not Democrats of the Democratic, or actually large d. I mean people who believe in democracy, not Democrats of the Democratic Party. But as people who believe in democracy, Republican democracy, any form of democracy you like, we just can't fathom the level of theft and corruption. You know, we catch a congressman, you know, grabbing a suitcase full of money or blowing a little cocaine up his nose, and we go apeshit crazy and lock him up for 20 years. That would never happen in China. Now, occasionally they shoot an occasional official. That's all window dressing. They'll go out and shoot a corrupt official to say that they're doing something about corruption. But since life is cheap in China, they don't give a fuck. That's just to fool people. In the end, they are suppressing the. It can't work. Again, and for the reasons I often cite, there's just no way a centrally controlled economy can deliver the goods for 1.3 billion people. It's impossible, literally impossible. So what's going on is you're seeing, and these buildings that are going up, by the way, if you were to go into them, most of them are empty. There's nobody in the offices, there's nobody in the condos. It's just a bunch of buildings being put up to fool the world, so money keeps flowing into these countries, into China, I should say, and keeps the gravy train running. And the way they're looking at it is, it's unending. This is how the Chinese look at it. They can steal from us as long as we're dumb enough to keep giving the money to them to steal. But ultimately, their own people will bring them down, because sooner or later, people get tired of taking it up the ass. And if you've been watching what's been going on in China carefully, you can see a lot of unrest building in China, and not just Hong Kong, but the whole country. Now, you don't see it in the mainstream press because A, it doesn't agree with the narrative that they want to put out, and B, the mainstream, in fairness, even those reporters who do understand what's going on, cannot get the access from the Chinese government to travel into the interior and see what's really happening among the other billion people. You know, if there are 10 billion, let's jump it up. Let's say there are 20 million people in Beijing, 20 million people in Shanghai, 20 million people in Wuhan, 20 million people in Hong Kong, and so on. Let's say that in the 10 largest cities in China, there are each average 20 million people. All of them are bigger than Los Angeles and New York, okay? Let's just pretend I don't know that that's true, but let's just pretend that comes to 200 million. There are 1.3 billion people. Where are the other 1.1 billion people? Do the math. Why do you never hear about them? And the answer is they're living out in the sticks in a still primitive country, an essentially controlled economy that doesn't deliver for them, being fucked on a daily basis by a corrupt ruling party, and there's going to be a revolution. And when that revolution, and it's not an if, it's a when that revolution comes, it will cause the collapse of the world economy. Okay, why? Because we have bought into this bullshit, and we have trillions of dollars, and when I say we, not just America, Germany, Australia, France, Britain, investors from all over the world have poured money into China because they want to believe it. And don't ever underestimate the herd instinct of people who think they can make a lot of money fast and easy. And on paper, they are making money. It's a classic scheme, a classic fraud. I know. I went to prison for fraud. I know what fraud looks like. This is a classic fraud. They're showing people returns that aren't real. Okay, on paper. No one double checks those numbers. The stocks go up on Wall Street, ultimately to blow up. Now, let's put that Chinese piece here. There are a couple other pieces we want to look at too. We're not done. That's the Chinese piece that will start the ball rolling. Now, we're going to add to that, on Wall Street, the stock market just breached 30,000. I cannot tell you. I've been working, or I worked, I should say, up until the time I went away, in finance from 1980 until 2012. During that period of time, I saw a lot of things, and the thing that always told me that the crash was coming, the crash of 86, the crash of 99, the crash of 2008, is when they all start saying it's all different now. Okay, it's all different now. I read an editorial. Today is Friday, December the 4th. Okay, this is Friday, December the 4th. Today, in today's New York Times, there's an editorial that says that deficits don't matter. I'm paraphrasing it, but printing up money and trillions of dollars of fiat currency and running deficits don't matter anymore. Okay, that's all old school. In the new world, it's all different now. Baby, when the New York Times starts running, it's all different now. Okay, you know we're fucked, all right? That is the manifestation of the mainstream. So now we have a highly leveraged government, and a highly leveraged stock market, the reason that, let me back up, okay. See, I get so excited sometimes. I follow my own reasoning, but I'm not logical enough with you. Okay. Stock market is over leveraged to 30,000. And remember, the underlying economy is in recession. Okay. And figures lie and liars figure. So you can say that unemployment's going down, but workforce participation is lower than it's ever been. So those numbers don't mean anything. Okay, you can have, 5% unemployment, but if 30% of the population is given up looking for a job, you really have 35%. Get it? That's what's going on now. Not that dramatically, but you get it. Almost that dramatically. We have extremely low workforce participation because we pay so many people not to work. So we have comparatively low unemployment because the figures are lying. But at least our figures are honest based on the people that are working, and if you spend a little bit of time, you can suss out what's really going on yourself, because we live in a free country with free speech and a free press, and there are plenty of places to go to look for that information. This exact same thing on steroids is happening in China, but no one can double check it. So our people being our investment banks and our Wall Street banks and our Wall Street firms, are making billions and billions and billions of dollars packaging Chinese stocks in what are called reverse splits, or actually reverse mergers, not reverse splits. I lost my train of thought. Reverse mergers. And if you don't know what a reverse merger is, when you watch the China hustle, they do a better job than I can do explaining it. So basically what happens is the Chinese find a shell American business that has failed but never been delisted from the stock exchange. So for example, they'll find some mining company in Nevada that at one point was, listed publicly, still is, no one has shut it down, but went bankrupt. So the only thing that exists is the shell. They buy the shell, they buy all the shares of the shell, they reverse merge with the shell, they call themselves, now they changed the name to, Shanghai Metals or whatever the fuck name they want to use. And then the stock is already listed, so they've bypassed the Securities and Exchange Commission, they've bypassed the National Association of Securities Dealers, they've bypassed the Justice Department and all regulation. Now they're on the stock exchange legally but nothing can be checked because they've done this reverse merger horse shit, and they're selling lies to the world. And we have invested not millions, not even billions, but we as the free world, trillions of dollars in China where the collapse is coming. You're starting to see it, right? Because when they go, we go. Because our entire economy is being now invested, not our entire, but it's enough of it, let's just say, to bring the whole fucking thing down in this lie. Okay, and it will simply fan out. Now, on top of all of that, we're throwing kerosene on this because we're printing trillions and trillions of dollars in fiat currency. This is what the New York Times was talking about. This is money with nothing behind it. The Federal Reserve simply prints it up, and they're lending it at near zero. Now, take a break here, and let's now switch our gears to Japan, not China. We're still in Asia, but we're going to go to Japan. Now, and the reason we're going to go to Japan is to illustrate why the massive printing of money and lending it at zero interest rates is such a danger. That's another factor adding to why 2021 is going to be the worst year ever. For the last 20 years or so, a little more than 20 years, the Japanese economy has been what the world has called, if you're not paying attention, a zombie economy. A zombie economy because the Japanese went to zero interest rates over 20 years ago. And therefore, they've been pumping money into big Japanese companies to keep them afloat ever since. And the Japanese economy is growing at less than 1% per year. And now, the last 20 years is just turning into the next 20 years. They are not. I've seen people who think they're coming out of it. They're not. Because what happens is when you lend money, especially made up money, to companies at these interest rates, a lot of companies stay in business that otherwise couldn't if they were paying real interest rates. In other words, the average interest rate in the United States debt market since the founding of the country in the 1700s has been 6%. Today we're lending money at near zero. That means there are a lot of companies alive today that if they were paying 6%, just the historic average, that's their whole profit. They would be out of business. They would be shut down. They would be destroyed by the creative destruction of capitalism, which is a good thing because it takes inefficiency out of the system. So that money can be reallocated in a new enterprise that is efficient that will replace it. That's how a free market works. But that's not what we're doing. We're copying Japan. We're lending money at zero interest rates, just like the Japanese have done for the last 20 plus years, to our companies. And so we have tons and tons of companies, our automobile companies, not all, but many of our airlines, many of our utilities, many of our technology companies are all only showing a profit and staying alive because they're being lent money at zero. And they're getting that money at zero because we have transitioned ourselves from a capitalist free market economy to a crapitalist economy, crony capitalism. So all of these big companies that are really zombies, that ought to be out of business and are only surviving because of low interest rates, now have full-time paid lobbyists in Washington strongly lobbying both parties. They're both complicit, Democrats and Republicans, to keep the money tap flowing. And the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, has stated clearly and publicly that he doesn't see interest rates raising for at least the next 7 years, which is a politician's way of saying forever, and that means zombie companies. So we have the combined built-up inefficiency of the world's second largest economy, China, being a mirage. It's not the world's second largest economy. For the 5 reasons I've stated, it is a total mirage. We have the world's largest economy investing in that mirage in a massive way, along with all of our trading partners in the free world. We have enormous amounts of Chinese debt invested that we've lent to companies and invested in companies that literally don't exist. They're just a mirage at a scale that would make Bernie Madoff blush. And we have this all coming together in a perfect storm of COVID. Okay, COVID is the last part of the puzzle. Okay? As we come out of COVID, we're going to find out that we were wrong about almost everything. Okay, you know, Joe Biden loves to say that he likes to go with the science. Here's what the science has really told us about COVID if you take all the emotion out of it. Number one, contact with surfaces, you know, touching things and then touching your face and stuff does not spread COVID. You know, by the way, you're looking at a guy that carries a bottle of hand sanitizer in the armrest of his car and constantly is, you know, squirting it on my hands. But that's just because I'm a germaphobe. It doesn't prevent COVID. COVID is an airborne virus that is spread by basically loud talking and shouting in closed places. Okay, you need to have expectorant, and it's about ventilation. So if you're outside and you're, you know, I'm at the park in the morning and I'm yelling to my dog, Pepper, Pepper, come, and I'm, you know, spitting. If I had COVID, I'd be throwing the, you know, the vapor into the air. But because I'm outside, it quickly dissipates and goes away. So there's no risk outside to my yelling. But if I'm in a, let's say, a music concert, a rock or a country music concert, and I'm with a bunch of other people and I'm yelling, you know, because I'm excited, I'm spewing COVID dust into the air into a poorly ventilated room, and that's how COVID is spread. That is the only way COVID is spread. It is not spread in the safest place you can be for COVID to not catch it is in elementary school. Of the 250,000 plus people that have died of COVID in the United States, less than 100 were under the age of 14. Not 100,000, 100. 3-digit number. And those obviously were very sick children to begin with. So out of 250,000, less than 100. So why did we close the public schools? Teachers unions. And that's just one small example. They just didn't feel like working and wanted to get full pay. Cut the crap. There was never any risk to the teachers to begin with. The science is clear. Children are safe. School is safe. It's the safest place you can be. I'd volunteer right now. They need a teacher. I'm in. Okay, I don't know what else to say. But this is just a small example of all the bullshit we bought, all these shutdowns, all these lockdowns. And the worst thing we did is pump trillions and trillions of dollars into the economy to subsidize something we didn't need to subsidize. Okay, we didn't need to shut down the economy. What we should have done is basically isolated the very, very at risk. You know, who's died of COVID? People over 65 with related health problems. They should have been isolated from the very beginning. We knew that at the very beginning, and the rest of the world should have gone on. And we, you know, our phobia with we call this the war on COVID, but we don't treat it like a war. If the President of the United States, if Donald Trump had been a real president, was really going to war, he would have told the public, look, we're facing a serious crisis, but we have to look at it like we look at war. And when we go to war, we know we're going to take casualties. So what we're going to do here is, but for the greater good, we have to take those casualties to save the country. So what we're going to do is isolate our old people, okay, and quarantine them to protect them. We're going to mask up the workers that work with them and make sure that they're protected as much as humanly possible. We're going to tell those of you younger than 65 who have risk conditions to also do the same voluntarily, and everybody else go about your business. And then, yes, people would have died, probably as many or maybe even a little more that have died already. But when you consider 250,000 deaths against 340 million people, and then you take out of those 250,000 deaths that most of them would have died anyway in the next 12 months of the related factors that killed them. In other words, you can be an old guy like me and have, let's say, adult onset out of control diabetes, and you're on your way out, and then you get COVID, now you're dead. Now you're cited as a COVID statistic, but you're going to die next year of complications of diabetes anyway. You could have congestive heart failure. I know tons of guys my age that walk around taking pills for congestive heart failure. That can kill you at any minute. You're going to die. Okay, now you get COVID and you die this year when maybe you would have died next year. And yeah, that's a COVID death, but is that really a COVID death? You know, our government never leveled with us to begin with. They pretended that we were all children and stupid and we couldn't understand risk and reward. So they went out and went draconian right away and appealed to people's fear, because really the first thing you learn when you're a salesman, and I've been selling for years, there are 4 things that sell things to people: fear, sex, greed, and empowerment. Fear, sex, greed, and empowerment. If you can touch one or more of those buttons, you can make people do whatever you want. For example, back in 1999, I wrote a book and I titled it, How to Get Filthy, Stinking Rich and Still Have Time for Great Sex. It is listed under my old name before I changed it, Herb K. It's still on Amazon. You can get it. Mr. Producer put it up. Although you can pick up paperback copies for pennies. It's about entrepreneurism. But anyway, and by the way, I call the internet crash in that book, in case you're curious. But to make a long, and that was printed before the internet crash, just want to make that clear so you can see that my predictions have generally been pretty good. To make a long story short, I titled that book that way because I knew, think about the title, How to Get Filthy, Stinking Rich and Still Have Time for Great Sex. Greed, filthy, stinking rich, great sex, sex. Greed and sex. Those are the 2 most positive motivators that there are. Well, people motivated by greed have intentionally blinded themselves to what's really going on. And I'm telling you, for all the reasons I've cited, the overprinting of money, and the only reason we haven't had a hyperinflation in this country, by the way, this is the point I was going for and then wandered off into the ozone, as I will do, is because that money is being absorbed by stock prices, okay? Inflation is caused by too much money chasing too few goods. That's the only thing that causes inflation. In simple English, that means if the government prints too much money for the economy and there aren't enough goods and services to soak up all that money they're printing, all the existing goods and services will soak up that money like a sponge soaks up excess water, which is rising prices. Now, why hasn't that happened? The answer, it has in some areas like real estate and stocks, and that's why. Because the speculation, the greed-driven financial markets, investing in Chinese securities and blindly investing in U.S. companies that you don't know anything about. I mean, let me ask you a question. I mean, if you own a mutual fund, you own stock in a lot of companies, do you have any idea what the fuck they do? I mean, do you really understand Google's business? Do you really understand Uber's business? Do you really understand Tesla's business? Really, I'm not talking about you heard it was good on some fucking podcast. Do you understand what it is you're investing in? No. Not really. I don't either, by the way. But when you invest in shit you don't understand and you're running along with a herd of lemmings over the cliff, you're going over the cliff. Most people are wrong most of the time. So when you combine that China does not cover any of the 5 bases, they do not have exchangeable currency, they do not have private property, they do not have free press, they do not have civil courts to protect property, they do not have a democracy, and we're throwing trillions of dollars at them, and we're throwing trillions more dollars into our own inflated financial markets when the underlying economy sucks, and the rest of the world is doing it too, and we continue to print money like crazy, and we're going to follow the Japanese example of zero interest rates creating zombie companies that only stay alive because they're not paying any money on their debt. In other words, their operations don't generate any profit. They're only staying alive because they're not paying any interest on their debt. This is a recipe for fucking disaster, and it will take very little to tip it over the cliff. I think the tip over is going to be the collapse of China. The revolution will become more and more evident, but it could be other things. Okay, it could be something I'm just not seeing, but whatever sets it off, whatever makes, it's the story of the emperor has no clothes. And you guys all know this story, and just, I'll do it really, really quick in case there's anybody left in the world who has never heard the story of the emperor's new clothes. But there was this famous emperor who, there was this kid, and he was, and I forget the exact story, but basically he was walking around naked in the castle. And everyone was afraid to tell him he was naked. So everyone said his new clothes looked great. He was like conned by this tailor who had him put on this naked outfit and make him believe it was this glorious thing that only the wealthy and only the rich could see. So since he was wealthy and rich and the king, he could see it, and wasn't he beautiful? And he was walking around the palace naked, and everybody was saying how great he looked, and they were all lying to him because they had to, until one I think it was a little kid, basically said, "Why are you walking around naked?" Okay, that's our financial markets. It's obvious they're naked. No one's seeing it because it's in everybody's interest to continue the lie. Okay, you get it? All that money invested in Wall Street, all that money invested from Europe, all that money invested from Asia, all of the and the Chinese are happily fucking everybody because A, there's no law against it, and B, they consider it a badge of honor. There's an old saying in China, and it's really great. It says it's easier to catch fish in muddy water. What does that mean? It really is an old Chinese saying, easier to catch fish in muddy water. It means that the fish can't see the line or the bait, they're going to be easier to hook. Okay, they're just going to react and get hooked to it. So if they can muddy up their financial numbers, and if they can lie to us, and if we believe this shit, if they muddy up the water and we believe it, and we invest money without really doing true due diligence, okay, going out to see if these companies and these things are actually real, if these buildings have people in them, if there's anything economic going on that's real, well, we're not. And so we're investing in muddy water, and it's going to come back to haunt us, and 2021 is the year. So that brings me to what you can do to protect yourself. Now look, you can tell me that I'm nuts, but I'm not, okay? And I invite you to please Google and fact check every assertion I make, because I am not talking bullshit, and it will stand up to research, and I invite you to do your research. I talk in colloquial terms. I'm profane, and I go fast, and I glance through things, and my mind shoots everywhere. But I'm giving you facts in general that are absolutely true, okay? And I want you to do your own research. I invite you to fact check me. I invite you to fact check me on the 5 things that China isn't. I invite you to fact check me on the leverage that's going on in the market. I invite you to fact check me on the Japanese economy. I invite you to fact check me on corruption. I invite you to fact check me on everything, okay? Everything I've told you is true. Now the only question is not if, but when. Let's put aside for a minute whether it's 2021 or 2022, because whatever it is, it's coming, and it's coming soon, okay? I think it's coming now because of all of this coming together in like a perfect storm of disaster. But, we might be able to stall it off for a period of months or even a year, but it's coming. So what can you do to protect yourself? I'm going to give you radical advice. Move every single loose penny you have out of financial markets and out of real estate and into a combination of precious metals and cryptocurrency like Bitcoin. And don't get fancy, just buy Bitcoin. Because, baby, it is the only thing that's going to save you. Now, I know how extreme this advice is. I know it's different than what anyone else is telling you. I know that this doesn't follow the advice of the mainstream. I know I'm just some guy in Phoenix, Arizona who's been to prison for fraud, for Christ's sake. And why you should believe me, well, look, you can either look into my eyes and decide if you think I'm telling the truth or not. If you think I'm not telling the truth, if you go out and fact check me and find out that anything I've said is a lie, then by all means, please don't believe a word I'm saying. But if I'm resonating with you, if I sound like a guy that actually sees it and is unencumbered by either greed or ambition, because as an ex-convict, I am not going to be the President of the United States or the Senator or the Governor from Arizona or the Mayor of Phoenix. I'm precluded from that. Okay, therefore, I got nothing to lose. I am happy to share with you the truth of what's going on because it doesn't hurt me. It only helps you. And part of my personal redemption and earning my way back into the good graces of, society and culture is to try to do positive things for my fellow Americans in particular. And this is what I'm doing here in the Radical Reset and talking about anti-politism. And an anti-political government, my friends, would have done none of this. They would not have printed up extra money. They would not have subsidized zombie companies. They would not be driving interest rates to zero. They would not be investing huge amounts because it's irrational. It's irrational. And when you take the ambition out of it and you take the greed out of it and you have an anti-political government, again, democracy by selection, not election. And in case you're wondering, if you haven't done it already, pick up your copy of A Radical Reset. This is the manifesto of anti-politism. It's available to you on Amazon. You can either buy the hardcover, the paperback version, I should say, if you wish, or you can download it to your reading device, or if you're a Prime member, and we're all Prime members, feel free just to read it from the Kindle Lending Library. Every time you turn a page, I get paid a little fraction of a cent. And that little fraction of a cent adds up when you have a lot of people doing it and helps pay for this podcast and the movement of anti-politism, which is the only hope for the American culture and country and the only hope for the world. Believe me when I tell you, it isn't socialism, which has failed everywhere it's been tried. It isn't the capitalism that we're in now. We are too conflicted by the cronies that have infected the U.S. government for there to be a rational decision. You can look, for example, at Biden's choices, and you can see him basically loading his administration with the old mainstream. That's what he's doing. He's bringing back what the Trump people threw out. Okay, we're not going to anything new. You know, his slogan, build back better, we're building back the same. And the same isn't going to work. The same old, you do the same thing over and over again and you expect a different result and you're not going to get it. And remember that in history, every century has a major disaster, and this century hasn't had one yet. In the 20th century, we had World War I, World War II, we had the outbreak of polio, we had the Vietnam War, we had, you know, and in this century, what do we had? 9/11. Now, 9/11, 3,000 people dead in New York City is terrible, but it's not 100 million people dead in 2 world wars. It's just not. It's just not the same thing. It's not the Great Depression. I forgot the Great Depression. It's not remotely the Great Depression, okay? It's just, it was a horrible thing, but it had no practical effect on the operations of the United States other than to make us do what we always do, which is to overreact because of fear and commit ourselves to things we never should have committed ourselves to, but that's another discussion for another day. And I am not downplaying 9/11 in any way. I'm simply saying that we do what we always do. Politicians overreact because they think it's a cheap way to get votes. And playing on fear, remember the 4 things: fear, sex, greed, empowerment. When you hear them trying to scare you, or you hear them trying to lure you, or you hear them trying to say that they can make your personal life better, you know, or they can empower you, they're lying. They're lying. All of that comes from yourself and from your family and from doing constructive things in your life. None of that comes from government, but they keep trying to sell it to us like it does. And we're headed for a fucking disaster. Well, I could go on, but I think I've exhausted this subject as far as it needs to go. Look, let me wrap it up and summarize. Do your own research, fact-check everything I've said, and for Christ's sake, move all your money to precious metals and Bitcoin, because the shitstorm is coming. And if you don't do it, and do it soon, you are fucked. And you will remember watching this podcast, this obscure little podcast coming out of Phoenix, Arizona, from some old ex-convict with a beard, and say to yourself, how did he know when nobody else knew? Well, let me tell you something. The guys who yell, you know, those of us who essentially are the canaries in the coal mine, are the ones that really sniff it out before anybody else, and well, I'm not dying like a canary would in a coal mine, but those of us who get it early are always fringe obscure figures. We're always people that no one pays attention to. We're always the ones that are, because the ones in the mainstream have too much motivation to lie, or if they're not lying, to be willfully ignorant. So anyway, that's where I leave it. If you haven't done it already, be sure to click the subscribe button, be sure to click the notification button, and most of all, because this is such an important video, I am, what's the word I'm looking for? I'm enlisting you in the war. Please, if you've never shared one of my videos before, and almost nobody has because there's like 45 people that watch them, but this is the moment. This is the video. This is the one. People need to wake the fuck up. I'm trying to save more than 40 people. I'm trying to save 340 million. And the only way we're going to do that is to spread the word. And it's not as difficult as you say. Not as you say. I don't know what that was. Probably a Freudian slip. As you think. It is amazing how fast the truth can get out when people begin to share it. Okay? So share the truth. It expands out, you know, I don't know what the word, in a compounded sort of way everywhere. It's going to spread everywhere. Spread the word. Save the country. Save the world. I feel like I'm on that show Hero. Remember that show Heroes? It just shows you how weirdly weird my mind is. Remember, you know, save the cheerleader, save the world. Save yourself, save the world. Save yourself, save the world. Get the fuck out of the way of the disaster that's coming. We're going to have a depression coupled with hyperinflation so vicious that it's going to cause societal collapse globally, okay? And we need to get ready for it, those of us who know what's going on, and prepare ourselves, because when the hour comes, and it will come fast and it will come without warning, we must be in a position to save our country. And that's where I'm going to leave it today. Thank you very much. I hope that this has made some sense to you. I hope that you agree with me. I hope you join the movement, and I hope you help change America and the world through anti-politism. And until next time, this is E.H. Ivins signing off.